So, Prince William just did something at Diana's memorial that the palace usually never allows. And honestly, nobody in that garden was prepared for it. He walked away from the official program, stepped past the aides holding the schedule, and knelt down in front of a small child holding a handwritten note. And the reason is honestly more heartbreaking than anyone expected. We're not talking about a scripted royal moment. We're not talking about a polished tribute written by a private secretary and signed off by Kensington Palace. We're talking about a son, 28 years after losing his mother, doing something so quietly human that grown men in the crowd reportedly turned their faces away because they couldn't hold it together. That's not a public relations moment. That's not institutional choreography. That's a man breaking a protocol he's followed his entire adult life because something in that garden, on that afternoon, refused to let him stay behind the line. And according to those briefed on the day's proceedings, senior aides had actually planned for him to remain on the raised platform for the entirety of the ceremony. He wasn't supposed to move. He wasn't supposed to speak off script. He definitely wasn't supposed to kneel. Before we get into it, if you're new here on Crown Watch, hit subscribe so you don't miss the updates on this one, because what happened in the hours after that gesture, inside Kensington Palace, and reportedly inside Clarence House as well, is still developing, and the family's response is only now beginning to take shape publicly. So let's talk about what actually happened here, because the timeline is pretty revealing when you lay it all out. The memorial was scheduled for the afternoon in the sunken garden at Kensington Palace, the same garden where the statue of Diana was unveiled in 2021, on what would have been her 60th birthday. Palace observers said the event had been in planning since early spring, quietly, without the fanfare of a state occasion. This wasn't meant to be a spectacle. It was meant to be, in the words of one aide reportedly involved in the arrangements, a family moment held in a public place. Around 240 guests were invited, including representatives of the charities Diana had championed during her lifetime, a handful of nurses from the hospices she used to visit unannounced in the late 80s, and a small group of families who had personally been touched by her work with landmine survivors and HIV patients. A royal patronage, by the way, is an official association between a member of the royal family and a charity or organization, where the royal lends their name and public support to the cause. Diana held over 100 of them at the height of her working life. William, according to insiders, had personally reviewed the guest list twice. The morning of the memorial reportedly began quietly. William was said to have arrived at Kensington Palace just before 9, having driven himself from Adelaide Cottage in Windsor. Catherine wasn't with him at that early hour. She joined later, closer to the ceremony itself, reportedly to give him the morning alone. And here's where it gets interesting. Because a senior aide, according to reports, told a small circle of staff that William had spent nearly 2 hours by himself in the garden before any guests arrived. Just walking, just standing near the statue. At one point, he reportedly sat on the low stone bench and read something from a folded piece of paper he'd taken out of his inside jacket pocket. Nobody knows what was on that paper. Nobody has asked. And nobody, according to those who were there, would ever ask. I know that sounds like a small detail. I know standing in a garden reading a folded note sounds like nothing on paper. But stay with me, because that folded note becomes the key to understanding everything that happened later. The ceremony itself began at 3 in the afternoon. There were short readings. A children's choir from one of Diana's former patronage schools sang a piece she was said to have loved. The Archbishop, according to reports, offered a brief blessing. And then William was scheduled to stand and deliver a short address, no more than 4 minutes, drafted by his private secretary and reviewed by both him and his communications team the night before. That address, according to those who saw the draft, was measured, institutional. It spoke of legacy, of continuing work, of gratitude to those who had kept Diana's causes alive in the years since her death. He never delivered it. Not the version on the page, anyway. William reportedly stood, took the paper out of his pocket, looked at it, and then folded it back up. He set it down on the small lectern in front of him, and then he began to speak without notes. Now here's where the contradiction starts to emerge between what the palace was projecting and what was actually happening behind the scenes of that ceremony. Because the institutional version of William, the Prince of Wales, has always been carefully constructed around the idea of composure. Composure at his mother's funeral in 1997, when he was 15 and walked behind her coffin with his brother, his father, his grandfather, and his uncle. Composure through every anniversary since. Composure when the tabloids picked at old wounds. Composure when he was asked, again and again, over decades, what she would have thought of this or that. And honestly, that composure is hard to argue with. It's the thing that made him, in the eyes of the British public, the future of the monarchy. It's the thing that separated his public presentation from his brothers, which we don't need to get into today. It's the thing that reportedly earned him the quiet approval of his grandmother in her final years, and of his father as he took on more responsibility during the king's health difficulties. I understand that instinct too. When you lose a parent that publicly, that young, in that manner, composure isn't just a virtue, it's a survival mechanism. It's the wall you build so the cameras don't get anything more from you than they've already taken. But here's the thing. According to insiders familiar with the family's private conversations in recent months, William has reportedly been going through what one aide described as a significant emotional recalibration since Catherine's cancer diagnosis and treatment last year. Palace observers said he came out of that period a different man, quieter in some ways, but also, reportedly, less willing to hide behind protocol when protocol felt hollow. That's not a small shift. That's the future king reassessing the terms of the role he inherited. And it was reportedly Catherine herself who, in the weeks leading up to the memorial, gently suggested that this year he might allow himself to do something he'd never done before. She reportedly told him he didn't owe the country another performance, he owed his mother the truth. That's the detail that changes everything. Because when William stood up in that garden and set the prepared remarks aside, he wasn't doing it on impulse. He was doing it after weeks of conversations at Adelaide Cottage. After conversations reportedly with George, his eldest son, who is now the same age William was when Diana first began preparing him for the life she knew he'd have to live. And there's a third ripple here that hit me hard when I heard about it. According to those briefed on the family's private discussions, George had asked his father, in the weeks leading up to the memorial, whether he was ever going to talk about her properly. Not the version in the books, not the version in the documentaries, her. The mother who kissed his cheek in the morning and made him laugh until he cried in the back of a car. George reportedly asked because he'd been reading about his grandmother in a school project, and something in what he'd read didn't match what his father had told him. That moment changed everything inside that household. Because William, according to reports, hadn't realized until then how much of Diana he'd been keeping locked away. Not out of pain, exactly, but out of a fear that giving too much of her to the public would leave nothing left for his children to have privately. And the tension between those two instincts, between protecting her memory and honoring it in front of the country, is the whole story. Both are valid, both come from love. And the fact that he'd been holding both truths at once for nearly 3 decades is why what happened next in that garden hit the way it did. So he stood there without notes. He looked out at the 240 people seated in that garden, and he reportedly said, in a voice that started steady and then didn't, that he wanted to talk about the woman his mother actually was, not the one people had built out of headlines. He said she had a specific laugh that he could still hear if he closed his eyes. He said she used to hide chocolate in the drawer of her writing desk and pretend she didn't know how it got there when he found it. He said she had told him once that being kind was harder than being clever, and that if he ever had to choose, he should choose kind. According to reports, several people in the front row had already begun to cry by that point. And then he did the thing nobody expected. He stepped down from the small raised area where the lectern was set up. He walked, slowly, across the grass towards the front row of seated guests. There was a girl there, reportedly around 8 or 9 years old, the daughter of a woman Diana had once visited in a hospice in 1996. The girl had been holding a small handwritten note in her lap for most of the ceremony. Aides had reportedly noticed her earlier but hadn't intervened. William walked to her. He knelt down in the grass, in front of the entire assembled memorial, in a bespoke navy suit, on the ground, and he asked her, gently, what she'd written. The girl, according to those close enough to hear, told him the note was for his mother. She said her own mother had told her that Princess Diana had sat with her grandmother when she was dying, and had held her hand, and had promised she wouldn't be alone. And the girl said she wanted Diana to know that her grandmother had told the story to her mother, and her mother had told the story to her, and now she was telling it to him, because she thought he should know that his mum had kept her promise. That's a pretty remarkable admission from a child at a public memorial. And it's a pretty remarkable thing to say to a man who has spent his entire life being told what his mother meant to strangers. William reportedly took the note. He didn't stand up immediately. He stayed there, kneeling in the grass, for what several observers said felt like a very long time. His shoulders, according to those closest, were shaking. He covered his face briefly with one hand. Catherine, from her seat a few rows back, didn't move. She didn't retreat into decorum. She didn't look away. She reportedly just watched him with the kind of steadiness that only comes from having been through your own version of the worst thing. And when he finally stood, he was holding the note carefully in both hands, the way you hold something that could tear. Now here's the thing about the sound in that garden at that moment. Multiple people said afterwards that they had never experienced silence like it at a public event. Not the awkward silence of a crowd waiting for something to happen. Not the reverent silence of a religious service. Something else. The silence of 240 people collectively deciding not to breathe. And in that silence, William walked back to the lectern. He didn't pick the prepared remarks back up. He looked at the folded note in his hand, and he said, reportedly, that this was the tribute. This was what his mother had left behind. Not statues, not foundations, not headlines. A promise kept in a hospice room in 1996 that a little girl was still carrying almost 3 decades later. He said that if there was one thing he wanted his own children to understand about their grandmother, it was that she had believed the small things were the real things. The hand held. The name remembered. The promise kept when no cameras were watching. And then, according to reports, he said something that broke the room completely. He said he had spent most of his life trying to be the son the country needed him to be, and not enough of it being the son she'd actually raised. And he said he was going to try, from now on, to do better on that second part. That was the line that did it. That was the line that, according to those in the front row, made grown members of Diana's former staff, people who had known her for years before William was even old enough to remember her, put their heads in their hands. By the time William stepped down from the lectern for the final time, the memorial was effectively over, even though it had another 20 minutes on the official schedule. The Archbishop reportedly chose not to add anything after that. The children's choir sang one more short piece. But the emotional center of the day had already happened, and everyone in that garden knew it. Word of what William had done began to travel almost immediately. By early evening, the first reports were on the wire services. By nightfall, clips of the address, filmed by the small pool of accredited photographers permitted inside, were being played on every major news broadcast in the country. And the reaction, honestly, was unlike anything I've seen for a royal moment in years. Outside Kensington Palace that night, people began to arrive. Not in the thousands the way they had in 1997, but steadily, in small groups, through the evening and into the following morning. They brought flowers. They brought handwritten notes. Several people, according to reports, brought small blue paper stars, an echo of the tributes left after the Queen's death and again during Catherine's illness. By dawn the next day, the gates of the palace were lined with them. A woman in her 70s, interviewed by one broadcaster, said she had come because she had watched William walk behind his mother's coffin as a boy, and she had waited nearly 30 years to see him allowed to grieve her out loud. She said she didn't know she'd been waiting for that until she saw it happen. The public response reportedly split along generational lines, but not in the way you might expect. Older citizens, many of whom had lived through Diana's life and death in real time, described the moment as the completion of something. A closing of a wound they had assumed would never close because William would never be permitted to close it publicly. Younger demographics, particularly those who had only known Diana through documentaries and archival footage, viewed it differently. For them, according to social media analysis conducted in the days after, the moment reframed William entirely. He wasn't the stiff older brother of a more colorful sibling. He wasn't the institutional heir. He was, suddenly, a man who had lost his mother when he was 15, and had been carrying it in silence ever since. And here's the small human detail that landed hardest for me. In the days after the memorial, a photograph began to circulate. It wasn't taken by an official photographer. It was taken, reportedly, by one of the charity representatives seated in the second row. It shows William, kneeling in the grass, taking the note from the little girl. What you can see, if you look closely, is that his thumb is pressed against the folded edge of the paper. The same way, reportedly, he used to press his thumb against the corner of the folded letters his mother left for him and Harry when she traveled without them. According to a former member of household staff who spoke to reporters years ago about that particular habit, it was something Diana used to do herself. A small, private tell. A way of holding on to something without holding on too hard. That's not nothing. That's a gesture inherited across a generation, showing up in front of the world at exactly the moment it needed to. Kensington Palace, in its official statement issued the following day, was characteristically brief. The statement said that the Prince of Wales had wished to mark the memorial in a personal way, and that the family was grateful for the many messages of support received from across the country and abroad. There was no elaboration. There didn't need to be. But according to those briefed on internal palace conversations, there was a discussion, reportedly, about whether the deviation from the prepared remarks should be addressed more formally. William, insiders said, was firm. This action was taken to honor his mother, not to make a statement. And the palace, in the end, agreed to say very little, because sometimes the most institutional thing you can do is stay out of the way of a moment that doesn't belong to the institution. Catherine, for her part, was reportedly the one who held the family together in the hours after the ceremony. She and William returned to Adelaide Cottage that evening with the 3 children. According to those close to the household, George asked his father, quietly, whether he'd said what he wanted to say. William, according to reports, told him he had. He said he thought his mother would have understood. And George reportedly then asked whether he could see the note the little girl had given him. William showed it to him, and the 2 of them, father and son, and future king, sat together at the kitchen table and read it. A moment nobody photographed. A moment nobody will ever describe in more detail than that. But a moment that, according to those who know the family well, may have been the most important one of the entire day. What this whole situation illuminates, honestly, is something the monarchy has struggled with for a very long time. There's a version of royal duty that treats grief as something to be managed, contained, and moved past on a schedule that suits the public. And there's another version, the version William reportedly chose in that garden, that treats grief as something that stays with you, evolves with you, and occasionally, when the moment is right, needs to be let out into the open where people can see it. Neither version is wrong. Both come from love. Both come from a sense of responsibility to something larger than yourself. But the tension between them is the story of this family, and it has been for longer than any of us have been paying attention. Duty and love aren't opposites. They're the same instinct pointed in different directions. Silence protects. Honesty heals. And sometimes, 28 years after the worst day of your life, you kneel down in the grass in front of a child holding a folded note, and you let both of those instincts finally meet. That folded piece of paper William took out of his pocket that morning, the one he read alone in the garden before anyone arrived, was reportedly seen back in his hand as he left Kensington Palace that evening. Nobody knows what was written on it, nobody has asked, and nobody ever should. Before we wrap up, if you want to stay updated on royal family news as it develops, make sure to subscribe to Crown Watch so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.